Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies revision video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are talking about the ontological argument for the existence of God. So we will be covering the AO1 knowledge and the AO2 evaluation points that you need to know for an A star. We'll be looking at Anselm's original formulation of the argument, and then we'll be looking at Gaunilo's criticisms of this before we consider his second formulation, which he devised in response to Gaunilo's criticisms, and we'll ask whether that adequately refutes those criticisms made by Gaunilo. We will also be considering a more contemporary ontological argument. We'll be looking at Descartes' version of an ontological argument, and then Kant's criticisms of this as well. So lots to talk about. Let's get started, shall we, with a quick overview of the OCR specification. Now, if you are doing AQA, please do not worry. Everything in this video will still be very relevant for your AO1 10 markers and your AO2 15 markers. But in terms of what OCR expect us to know, we need to know about Anselm and his two formulations of the argument. We need to know Gaunilo's criticisms of his first formulation, and then we'll also be looking at Kant's criticisms. And as I say, we'll be talking about Descartes' version because it is Descartes' version to which Kant was responding. OCR also give us these 4 bullet points that we need to consider. So we will be focusing on these 4 bullet points in this video. Firstly, whether a posteriori or a priori is the more persuasive style of argument. And remember, the teleological and cosmological arguments are a posteriori arguments for the existence of God, whereas today's argument, the ontological argument, is an a priori argument for the existence of God. We also need to consider whether or not existence can be treated as a predicate. Kant would certainly disagree and say it cannot be. We'll be considering whether or not the ontological argument justifies belief. So which groups of people does this argument work for, if any at all? Does it work for a theist, for example? Would it convince an atheist that actually there is a God? And then finally, we'll be asking whether or not there are logical fallacies in this argument that cannot be overcome. Remember, a logical fallacy is a flaw in the logic of the argument. You may remember that with the cosmological argument, we looked at the fallacy of composition as a criticism. So we'll again be critiquing the structure and the logic of this argument for the existence of God. So let's get started by just meeting for the first time today the 4 key philosophers we need to know for this topic. And please remember that in order to secure your A star, you need to refer to scholars in every single paragraph. So in an essay on the ontological argument, you would be referring to St. Anselm, you would be talking about Gaunilo, you'd be referring to Descartes, and you'd also be talking about Kant as well. There are, of course, many other scholars that you can bring in. Please do make those synoptic links. I think there's always a great opportunity with this topic to make some synoptic links to religious language and to Wittgenstein, for example, and his thoughts on language games. So I'll be signposting those to you as well as we go through this video. But yeah, remember, in your A-level essays, you must make sure you mention a scholar in every single paragraph. And so with the ontological argument, it's always going to be Anselm, it's always going to be Gaunilo, and you might also be mentioning Descartes and Kant as well. So before we actually look at the ontological argument, I think it's important to take a step back and consider that this is an a priori argument. So the key question really is, what is an a priori argument? Well, the word itself, a priori, really gives us a great insight and indication into what these arguments are all about, because a priori is referring to the fact that this argument is made and the conclusions are reached prior to experience. So you are making your argument and you are reaching conclusions prior to experience. So prior in this case means prior to, which means before experience. So a priori knowledge is independent to experience. It comes before experience. It concerns facts that are known before experience. So Anselm is not going to be using empiricism in this argument. Examples of a priori knowledge are, of course, mathematics, things like 2 + 2 = 4, and also tautologies, which is where something is true by definition. For example, a triangle has 3 angles. The word itself contains the definition because triangle literally means 3 angles. So a tautology is when it's true by definition. And so a priori knowledge, is all about deduction from pure reason. You are using reasoning, you are using logic, you are not using empirical observation, you are not gaining knowledge through experience. Remember, it is prior to experience. And of course, one of the great things about this is that it leads to certainty. If the premises are correct, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So it is seen as a good thing that these arguments lead to certainty. And the ontological argument for the existence of God is an example of an a priori argument. In contrast to this, then, we have got our a posteriori arguments. And again, the word itself gives us a real insight into what these arguments are all about, because posteriori means post-experience. So this is an argument that you make and a conclusion that you reach post-experience, which means after experience. So in other words, these arguments do use empirical observation. They are based on observations and knowledge gained through the senses. So as I've put here, they make use of the empirical method. They use sensory experience and observation to gain knowledge about the world. So a posteriori arguments use empirical facts, which of course are known through the senses, to then make inferences about what is true. So you have your empirical observations and then you infer things based upon them. You make inferences based on them. So that is why a posteriori arguments are known as inductive arguments, because they involve making inferences based on observations. And this, of course, means that unlike a priori arguments, which lead to certainty, they actually lead to probability. So, of course, you could say that a priori arguments are better because they lead to certainty, as if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Whereas, of course, a posteriori arguments are all about making inferences based on observations, so they can only lead to probability. But of course, you know, the thing with a posteriori arguments is that they are consistent with that scientific method, and that reflects the epistemic imperialism of 21st century society, where we do value empirical evidence. And so you could say, actually, you know, they are more consistent with the approach to knowledge taken by people in the modern world. And of course, our two examples of a posteriori arguments are the teleological argument for the existence of God, which is based on that evidence of design and then making the inference that there must be a designer who is God, and then the cosmological argument, which again is based on that empirical observation that everything has a cause. And so again, the universe must have a cause, and the inference that's made is that that must be God. So they are the two key types of argument that we look at for the existence of God. And today we're focusing on an a priori argument, which is an argument made prior to experience. It is reached independent to empirical observations, and it is, of course, therefore a deductive argument for the existence of God. Let's have a look then at the key headlines for the ontological argument. So before we do get into Anselm's formulations, Galileo's criticisms, and then Descartes and Kant as well, I just want to start by giving you the headlines. I've got 3 bullet points for you in terms of what the ontological argument actually claims. So let's have a look. The first one is that the proposition God exists is a priori and deductive, as we have just seen. So Anselm believed that the proposition God exists can be known to be true without reference to sense experience, just by thinking about God's nature. And this is very much dependent on Anselm's definition of God. So this is a priori and deductive argument. He believes that you don't need empirical evidence to prove the existence of God, that actually this can be known to be true a priori without any reference to sense experience. And that is because of the definition of God that Anselm puts forward. He defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And he says that that means God must exist both in the understanding and in reality. So again, if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So we're going to say that this entire argument depends upon Anselm's definition being correct, because Anselm believes, and belief is an important word with Anselm because he believed that belief precedes understanding. He believes that the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so he says that means God must exist not only in the understanding as an idea, but also in reality, because of course, otherwise there could be an even greater being, which would go against the definition of God. So a very clever use of language, you could say there, or some critics would say a very foolish use of language. And then finally, the third key claim made is that God's existence is a necessary truth, not a contingent one. And this is really important for Anselm's second formulation of the ontological argument, because Gaunilo applies his definition of God to an island, and he says, listen, if this argument works, then surely you can define an island into existence as well. And so as part of Anselm's rebuttal to that, he says that it is incorrect to compare God to an island, because whilst an island is a contingent thing, God is a necessary being. So he is going to say that God is a necessary being and that his existence is a necessary truth, not a contingent one, with the word contingent meaning dependent on something else for its existence. So we'll be talking about these three claims today as we look through the ontological argument AO1 and AO2. So I think we'd better get started really with an introduction to the main man behind this argument, who is Saint Anselm of Canterbury. And as with so many of the different arguments we look at on the course, it is important to consider the context within which the philosopher was thinking and where their ideas actually come from. So for Anselm, just to give you the headline dates here, he was born in 1033 and he died in 1109, although that sounds like I'm giving the time he died. It was in the year 1109. I think I'm saying that correctly. He was a Benedictine monk, a theologian, and a philosopher. And the key takeaway here is that he was, to use Wittgenstein's language games, immersed in a theistic and a Christian form of life. So he was not a neutral philosopher. He was immersed in belief in God. And his mantra, his motto in life was that belief precedes understanding. So we have to remember that the context in which Anselm came up with this argument was that he was a monk, he was a theologian, and he was then actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important Christian in the land. So that really emphasizes the strength of his own faith, which I think then reflects the fact that he just assumes everybody else shares his definition of God, because he believes in that definition. He then uses that definition to reach the conclusion that God must necessarily exist. So it is important to consider that Anselm is operating within this Christian and theistic form of life. And so that definition, I want to remind you of his definition. He defined God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And this is the starting point for his argument. And it really does underpin the entire argument. And one of the criticisms that we're going to give is that not everybody shares that definition of God. Richard Dawkins, for example, would define God as a delusion. So we can argue that Anselm's argument only works as a deductive argument if you believe his definition of God is correct. Because if you don't believe that definition of God is correct, then the entire argument is going to fall apart. Very interestingly, Aquinas actually criticized Anselm's argument, because he said we can't define the nature of God. We can't actually know the nature of God. But of course, for Anselm, he is very keen to define the nature of God. He says God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And then, as I mentioned, his motto, his mantra in life is here. It's a Latin phrase, credo ut intelligam. There you go. There's my year 7 Latin lessons paying off for me there. So he believed that I believe in order to understand. So he believed that belief precedes understanding. And what that means is he believes in the importance of having faith first. So you should have your faith in God first, and then you should seek to prove or confirm and justify your belief. But you have to start with belief. So of course, this again shows us that his argument only works for people who already believe in God. And even then, some people who do believe in God don't like his argument. Gaunilo, for example, was a monk who completely rejected the argument. Aquinas rejected the argument because, as I say, he didn't believe you could actually define the nature of God. But in terms of who this argument will work for, Anselm is quite prepared to admit that people who don't believe in God are probably not going to like this argument, because he believed you have to have belief first. You should have your belief, And then you should seek to work out what that means. You should then seek to justify, to use the language of the OCR specification, the belief that you have. So yes, he was a man of God. He was, a committed Christian. He had really strong faith. And then in terms of whether this argument is persuasive, we do then have to ask, well, doesn't that show it might only work for people who share his faith, rather than looking for philosophical proof for the existence of God? I hope that makes sense. Hopefully it will start to make more sense as we talk through his argument. So we are going to start doing that now by looking at his first formulation. So let me talk you through. Number one, by definition, Anselm believed God is a being greater than which nothing greater can be conceived. And he thought everyone can conceive of God in their mind. So he talked about the fool in the Psalms. And he said everybody who rejects God must have an idea of God, because how can you reject something you don't know about? So he says even the fool in the Psalms who says there is no God has an idea of God, because you can't say there isn't something if you don't know what you're saying isn't there. I've not really worded that well, but what I mean to say is if you're going to talk about God, even if it's just to say there is no God, you have an idea of God. So that shows everyone can conceive of God in their mind. And Anselm believed that it is greater to exist than not to exist. Therefore, he concludes God must exist both in the mind and in reality. Otherwise, there would be an even greater being. And of course, that's not logically possible because of the definition he has for God. Let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, the starting point for Anselm is the fool in the Psalms. He refers to the Psalms, which say, the fool says in his heart that there is no God. And Anselm makes the point that atheists know what they are rejecting. They must understand God. They must be able to conceive of God, because they have to understand God in order to say that he doesn't exist. Therefore, Anselm is saying atheists have a common understanding with theists of God in their minds. Now, Anselm's definition of God is that he is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So God is the greatest possible being. And importantly, he is assuming everybody shares this definition. So he is assuming that when the fool says in their heart that there is no God, they are saying that there is no being, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And as I mentioned before, is he making a mistake there? Is that a fallacy? Is that a flaw in his argument, that he's assuming everybody shares his definition of God? Someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, would define God as a delusion, or as a man-made construct. He believed that the atheist understands that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, just as much as the theist. And so he says everybody, atheist and theist, knows that God does exist in the mind. So God exists in everybody's mind as an idea. And so he then tries to be very clever with that, because he says the definition of God is that he is the greatest possible being. And Anselm, remember, says it is greater to exist in reality than just in the mind. So he says, everyone who understands God knows he can't just exist in the mind alone, because then there could be an even greater being. And that would be a contradiction of the definition. So by definition, he believes God must necessarily exist both in the mind and in reality. So he thinks he's been really clever here. He's got one up on the atheists, because he's saying, well, if they know what they're rejecting, then they know God. And so they must know that God necessarily exists. So he's trying to use the definition of God to define God into existence and to necessitate his existence. But of course, there are a lot of problems with this. And of course, the key problem is that assumption he's making, that everybody shares that definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But yeah, that is his first formulation of the argument, that the definition of God means God must necessarily exist both in the mind and in reality, because he is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So what did Gaunilo say about this? What did Gaunilo make of this? Well, it's important to remember that Gaunilo was another monk. So he was a Christian monk. So he was not just a man of God, but he was very committed to his belief in God. So it's not like Gaunilo was an atheist who you would expect to be rejecting the argument. Gaunilo was a monk himself. And so I think that really emphasizes the problems with the structure of the argument, not necessarily the conclusion that there is a God, because Gaunilo does agree with that conclusion, but the way in which Anselm has reached that conclusion. So he was a monk who wrote on behalf of the fool to show that understanding Anselm's definition of God does not necessarily mean God exists. You can't just say that because you can conceive of God in your mind, that means God must exist in reality. That is too big of a jump. That is a fallacy. That is a flaw in the structure of the argument. He believed that you cannot define God into existence. You can imagine or understand the concept of God and even imagine or understand Anselm's definition of God, but this doesn't mean that God must therefore actually exist. And in order to prove his point, he used the example of a perfect island. So he took Anselm's argument, he took the structure of the argument, he took the formula of the argument, and then he replaced God with island. So he said, right, I'm going to substitute God for an island, because then I'm going to show you that the logic of this argument, the structure of this argument, is actually fatally flawed. So he said, right, instead of imagining the greatest conceivable being, I want you to imagine the greatest conceivable, most perfect island somewhere in the ocean. And he said, if you were told about the island, you would be able to imagine it. So in the same way that Anselm is saying an atheist can conceive of God, he is getting his reader to conceive of this island. And remember, he's saying this island is defined as the greatest possible island, which is that than which no greater island can be conceived. So he's got Anselm's definition and he's replaced being with island. He says, suppose you are told there is therefore no doubt that this island exists, not just in your mind, but also in reality. You wouldn't believe that, would you? So if I told you, right, I want you to imagine an island, that than which no greater island can be conceived. And you're going to be imagining that island. You're imagining what's on that island, what the temperature's like, what food there is, what restaurants there are, etc. You're imagining the island. And please do this, by the way, guys. It's a great thought experiment. If I then said, well, that island must necessarily exist then, because if you can think it in your head as the greatest possible island, then it must exist in reality as well, because otherwise there could be an even greater island. So that would contradict the definition. You would not then go, okay, brilliant, that island does exist. Get me on a plane. Let's go there. Let's move in there now. You wouldn't, would you? Because you understand that you can conceive of it as the greatest possible island, but that doesn't mean it then actually exists. You cannot think that island into existence. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would absolutely love to. And then, as I say, jump on the plane and move there straight away, but it just doesn't work like that. And so the point that's being made by Gaunilo here is that using the structure of Gaunilo's argument, you would not feel that anything had been proven because there is no actual evidence of this island existing. So it absolutely can exist in your imagination, but that doesn't then necessitate its actual existence in reality. So he's saying you cannot define an island into existence in the same way you cannot define God into existence. Just by saying it is the greatest conceivable island, that doesn't mean it can therefore exist in reality. Because, of course, you could jump in that plane and fly around the world looking for the island, and unfortunately, you are not going to find it. And of course, there is then the other problem that everybody thinks of the island in a different way. So everybody's got a slightly different idea of what's on their island. One person might want it to be really hot, for example. Somebody else might not be able to stand the heat, so they want it to be covered in igloos and snow. So, of course, we've then got the problem of if everybody is conceiving of the island, how many islands are there? Are there now 8 billion islands out there? In the same way, if you're saying to people, well, if you can conceive of God, then God must necessarily exist. If everybody conceives of God in a slightly different way, in the same way that your perfect island would have different features on it, does that mean there are then 8 billion different gods? Can that prove the existence of the monotheistic God Anselm believes in? So hopefully you're starting to see the problems, the flaws, the issues with the structure of Anselm's argument. So if we take his argument, if we take that formulation and we replace God with an island, what do we find? Well, we find it doesn't prove anything at all, that the argument is unsatisfactory and it's unsuccessful for proving the existence of something. In this case, proving the existence of the island. You would then want empirical evidence of that island. You'd want to see a picture of it, for example. You'd want to actually go there yourself. And in the same way, we can say Anselm's argument doesn't prove the existence of God. You then need actual evidence for God. You can't just define God into existence any more than you can, unfortunately, not define the island into existence. What did Anselm have to say about that then? Well, it's fair to say he didn't take this lying down. So he actually read Gaunilo's criticism and he hit back. He came up with a rebuttal in response. And this is what he said. We're going to call this Anselm's ontological argument 2.0. This is the second formulation of his argument. So this is now his response to Gaunilo, who has, we could argue, satisfactorily challenged and ultimately fatally undermined the structure of Anselm's argument. And he has demonstrated that it is unsuccessful. But Anselm is not giving up. He's not thrown in the towel, because he says that Gaunilo has made a mistake. He has mistakenly assumed that you can compare God to an island. And so when you're taking the structure of Anselm's argument, that you can substitute island for God. And what Anselm is saying is you cannot do that, because he says that islands are contingent, which means they depend on something else for their existence, whereas God is necessary. He said that God is a special case. Of course he did. And so you cannot compare God to an island. He said beings you can imagine not existing are called contingent beings. They are contingent because they depend on something else for their existence. In contrast, beings that cannot not exist are called necessary beings. And so he believes that necessary beings are better than contingent beings because, of course, you know, for something to depend on something else to exist would not mean it's a great thing because it's dependent on something else, whereas a necessary being cannot not exist. So it's better than a contingent being. Now, of course, as we link back to Anselm's original definition, if God were a contingent being, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being because there could be another being that was necessary rather than contingent. And so Anselm says that God's definition means that he must be a necessary being because his definition is the greatest possible being. And so God is a necessary being, and so he cannot not exist. He must, by definition, exist. So what Anselm is doing here, again, you could say it's quite clever, or on the other hand, you could say it still doesn't work, is that he's saying God is a special case. So Gaunilo's criticism doesn't work because you can't compare God to an island, because God is a necessary being, again, based on his definition of God, whereas an island is a contingent being. So again, it all comes back to definitions. It all comes back to the use of language. So Anselm's definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So my question to you at this point is, do you think Anselm's rebuttal here, do you think his second formulation here adequately refutes the challenge presented by Gaunilo? Because Gaunilo has used his perfect island example to critique the structure and the setup, if you like, of Anselm's argument. And of course, the question that you've got to consider now is, was he successful in doing that? Has Gaunilo fatally undermined Anselm's argument? Or does his second formulation, where he makes a distinction between contingency and necessity, does that actually rescue his argument? Does that redeem him? Does that actually see off the challenge put forward by Gaunilo? Well, that is actually my next question to you. Does Anselm adequately refute Gaunilo's criticisms? You could say, well, no, he doesn't, because you cannot define God into existence. Simply saying that God exists necessarily doesn't mean that he does. People need more evidence or proof. As we said about the island, you then actually want to see the island for yourself. You want to see a photo of that island that's so perfect and amazing. And you want to actually go there to actually verify empirically that it does exist. And you can say, well, we need to then do the same for God. You cannot make an a priori argument for the existence of God. You need to have empirical evidence as well. And we can say, especially in the 21st century, an age of epistemic imperialism for science, people value empirical evidence. They want to be able to see the proof. They are not going to accept an a priori argument that seeks to just define God into existence. Another problem, of course, is with that definition of God. We can say that we do not have a common understanding of God. Anselm is assuming that everybody does share his definition. That term that he uses, greatest possible being, means different things to different people, doesn't it? So in the same way that everybody has a different idea of their perfect island, everybody has a different idea of God. We have plenty of unreal objects in our minds, and we all have different variations of them. This is perfectly usual. Another example that you could use is gossip. You can imagine the people that you are discussing, but that doesn't mean what we're being told about them is true. So if I told you something about Kim Kardashian or, I don't know, Ronaldo, and I told you they've done something, you can probably imagine them doing that in your head. You can see them doing that in your head, but that doesn't mean they actually have. So we can't gossip something into existence. So in the same way, we can imagine God existing as the greatest possible being, but that doesn't mean he actually does. So again, it's that difference between thinking about something, conceiving of something, and then actually saying it must be the case in reality. We can say that is a too great of a leap. It's a jump, and you can't make that jump. You then need actual evidence for what you believe is happening in reality. And we could also say that we are fully aware of our own existence, but we can also think of our non-existence. You can conceive of you not existing. So we could ask, why should it not be the same with God? We can imagine God's non-existence as much as we can imagine God's existence. God does not necessarily exist just because we can think about the concept of him existing. Again, you can link it back to the need for empirical proof, that you cannot define God into existence any more than you can define an island into existence. So it would be great to hear in the comments your thoughts on these bullet points and whether you think Anselm does adequately refute Galileo's criticism in his second formulation of the argument or not. But for now, we're going to have a look at some support for Anselm from a more contemporary version of the ontological argument, which was developed by René Descartes, who defined God, again, it's about definitions, as a supremely perfect being. Let me talk you through the argument. Number one, I have the idea of God. And again, it's all about definitions. That idea of God is a supremely perfect being. So Descartes' ontological argument is centered around the belief, the idea that God is a supremely perfect being. And so the key word that Descartes is going to use is perfection. Whereas with Anselm, it's about being the greatest. So it's all about greatness. For Descartes, it's about him being perfect and possessing all necessary perfections. One of those perfections is existence. The third point here is that existence is a perfection. So Descartes is going to conclude God must exist, because if he didn't possess existence, then he would not be perfect. Descartes believes that existence is therefore central to the essence of God, because God is a supremely perfect being. He must possess existence, because if he didn't possess existence, he would not be perfect. He wrote, and this is actually a really great quote. There are some really great examples that he uses here. It is quite evident, so that's how confident and convinced Descartes is, that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that it's three angles, that should say. I've spelt that word wrong, please. I'm just going to actually have to cross that out because that really is offending me, that terrible typing there. I'm going to get the red pen, guys, and I'm going to cross that out. Please excuse that typing. What I meant to put there is 3, the number. So let me start that again. It is quite evident that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that it's 3 angles equal 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain that can be separated from the idea of a valley. So he is saying that in the same way that a triangle must have 3 angles, and in the same way that a mountain must have a valley, he is saying that God must have existence. You cannot separate existence from God because it is central to his essence. So in the same way that a triangle must have 3 angles, God must have existence because it is central to his essence. So has he got a point here, or is he again flawed in his thinking? Descartes' point is that God is by definition perfect. So again, it's about definitions. With these ontological arguments, it's all about definitions. He says an imperfect God would not be God. So if God is perfect, he must contain, he must possess all perfections, and that would include the perfection of existence. If God did not exist, he would not be perfect. So he must, by definition, again, exist. So whenever you are talking about Descartes, you're talking about perfection and the idea that if God is the supremely perfect being, then God must possess existence, because if he didn't, he would not be perfect, and so he would not be God. He believes that existence is a defining predicate of the concept of God, in the same way that having three sides and three angles, I have spelt it correctly there, I hope you've noticed, is necessary to the concept of a triangle. So by definition, a triangle has three angles, and in exactly the same way, Descartes believes, God has existence. And again, it's by definition. It is central to the essence, to the fabric, to the DNA, to the core of God. You cannot separate existence from God any more than you can separate a mountain from a valley. So they go hand in hand. They cannot be separated. They cannot be seen as distinct. You cannot imagine God as not existing, because then that would not be God. Well, one person that wasn't impressed by this was Immanuel Kant, who gave two criticisms of Descartes' ontological argument. The first one is that his argument uses flawed logic. He argued that if you accept that there is a God, it is logical to accept also that his existence is necessary. But here is the point. You don't have to accept that there is a God in the first place. And he actually used the example of a triangle, which we can all agree is true by definition, that a triangle has three angles. But here's the important bit that Descartes is missing. The triangle only has three angles if the triangle exists in the first place. So what he's saying there is that if God exists, then God does exist necessarily, in the same way that if the triangle does exist, the triangle will have three angles, because that's what makes it a triangle. However, if God does not exist in the first place, then he does not necessarily exist. So Kant is saying that you can understand Descartes' definition without it being true in reality. So again, it's this critique. You can't define God into existence. We can reject a concept together with all its defining predicates. So you can say, well, if God does exist, then God's existence is necessary. But if God doesn't exist in the first place, then there isn't a God to talk about. So the argument uses flawed logic because it is trying to define God into existence. And the key example and the key line I'd use in an exam is the triangle only has three angles if the triangle exists in the first place. So the key headline from Kant is that ontological arguments are bad logic, and they use bad logic because they make us suppose that if we justify God's perfection as including existence, we are assuming God does exist. And that is flawed. You cannot define God into existence in this way. A second criticism then is that existence is not a predicate. So Kant believed that existence is not a predicate at all. It adds absolutely nothing to our understanding of a concept. So to say that God exists doesn't tell us anything about God. So it's not helpful to be using it as a predicate. By saying God exists, you are just asserting that in the real world, there exists an object which corresponds to the concept of God. So to say that something exists adds nothing at all to the concept or idea of a thing. And he used an example, a very famous example actually, of 100 thalers, which were the currency of the time. And if I wanted to describe to you what those thalers are like, I might say that they are gold, they're metallic, they're round, they contain an image of the king because they are the features, they are the characteristics of those coins. But if you asked me to describe a thaler and I said the thaler exists, that wouldn't give you any information. That wouldn't give you any insight whatsoever, would it? If I just said the thalers exist, you'd look at me and you go, right, but what are they like? What are their features? What are their qualities? What are their properties? And what Kant is saying is that to just say they exist adds nothing to our understanding of them. And importantly, it does not prove that they actually do exist. You can't say that the thalers exist because they exist, any more than you can say God exists because God must exist. It doesn't actually provide us with any authoritative reason to believe it is true in reality. So the only way to prove that those coins do exist is to experience them and to see for ourselves that they are gold, metallic, round, and contain an image of the king through our senses in reality. So you can't just say that God necessarily exists because that is part of his nature. You have to give more in terms of the predicates you're providing, and you then have to be able to use those predicates to prove that God does exist, in the same way of proving that those sailors are there. I need to be able to tell you what they're like, how they're going to look, how they're going to feel, and you then need to be able to find them, to feel them, to then verify that they do actually exist. For me to just turn to you and go, well, they exist, is not going to then help you to verify and to feel confident that they do actually exist in reality, in the real world. Another example of this is from Bertrand Russell. He gave the syllogism. Oh, no, I can't even say the words. Syllogism. Did I say it correctly? Someone will correct me in the comments, no doubt. I do apologize. Just as long as you can spell it, that's all that matters. He said that, number one, men exist. Number two, Father Christmas is a man. Number three, therefore, Father Christmas exists. So again, it's about the problems of existence as a predicate. You cannot use this word to prove something does exist. It is unsatisfactory, it is unhelpful, and it doesn't make any meaningful contribution to our understandings of the real world and what does actually exist in the real world. So let's now take a step back from these arguments and look at the strengths and the weaknesses of ontological arguments. The first strength that I've got for you is that a strength of a priori arguments in general is that if you accept the premise, then the conclusion must be true as it is logically necessary. And of course, we've said that a few times in this video, haven't we? That if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is true. But of course, the big problem and the critical analysis you could bring in there is that if you don't believe in Anselm's definition of God, then the conclusion that God necessarily exists in reality doesn't work for you. So of course, a priori arguments are deductive and they have that certainty, but that is all based on accepting the premises. And if you don't accept the premise, which in this case is Anselm's definition of God, then the conclusion means nothing to you at all. Another strength is that it works for theists who share Anselm's definition of God. It is based on a theologically and philosophically convincing definition of God. You could say that defining God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, or as the greatest possible being, is consistent with what theists do believe about God. So we can say that is a strength of this argument. It confirms, we could argue, their faith in God. Remember, Anselm did believe that belief precedes understanding. So for someone who shares his definition of God, who will therefore accept that first premise, the conclusion that he reaches can confirm their faith. It can justify their belief in a logical, deductive way. However, of course, we could have a critique there, we could have more critical analysis there, that Aquinas said it is impossible to understand the essence of God. So actually, the fact that the argument is based on a definition of God means that it is flawed, because you can't ever fully understand the definition of God. Another strength is that Anselm's response to Gaunilo with his second formulation may be seen as satisfactory for some theists. They might agree you cannot compare God to an island, as he is a special case. You could say the distinction between contingent and necessary beings does make sense, and that will satisfy some theists. But of course, the contrasting point there is going to be that, again, if you are outside of that language game, is that going to satisfy you? If someone turns around and goes, well, God is a special case, surely believing that God is a special case is a matter of faith. So you have to have faith first before that second formulation will work for you. And then finally, you could say Descartes' more contemporary version, which of course is about using perfection, and he uses the example of a triangle and a mountain with its valley, that could be seen as more logically satisfying for some theists, because again, the argument is deductive and analytic. There is no reliance on empirical evidence. So for a theist, they might be satisfied by it, and they might find it is a way of justifying their faith in God. However, if we look at our weaknesses, you could say that a limitation of a priori arguments is that if a premise is shown to be inaccurate, then the whole argument fails. So if the premises are not watertight, if they are not guaranteed to be correct, then the conclusion is, of course, going to be incorrect as well. So we would say that if someone doesn't accept his definition of God, and frankly, why would they? You know, there is no reason to believe that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He really seems to have plucked that out of thin air. He seems to have woken up one morning and assumed everybody shares that definition of God. Well, if you don't share that definition of God, then why is the conclusion that God must exist in reality going to work for you? So if you go up to a random person in the street and you use this argument, is it going to convince them? Are they going to come away from your conversation thinking they're right? God must necessarily exist. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that there is a God. Or are they going to walk away thinking that person needs help? You know, someone call them a doctor. You could say then, building on this, that it only works for people who accept Anselm's definition of God, which not everybody does, as we know. As I mentioned, make that synoptic link to religious language and to language games, that it only works within Anselm's form of life. You know, not only within a Christian form of life, because of course different Christians might understand God differently. It only works within a very restricted form of life where you actually share Anselm's exact definition of God. Remember, for him, faith must come first, belief must precede understanding. So it is limited to those who believe in Anselm's definition of God. But remember then, to strengthen your criticism here, you can say even theists reject the argument. So our main criticism is from Gaunilo, and he is a monk who thinks the argument is absolutely rubbish. Obviously not academic language there. He thinks the argument is fatally flawed. It's unsatisfactory and it's unsuccessful. Because remember, he says you cannot define an island into existence and you cannot define God into existence. So the argument doesn't work. Another criticism is from Aquinas. He said it's impossible to understand the essence of God. So the idea that you can define God into existence is going to be flawed. Remember, Kant had two criticisms as well. He said ontological arguments use flawed logic and that existence cannot be used as a predicate. And then a final weakness for you is from Anselm, who came up with this idea of epistemic imperialism, that in the modern world, we live in an age of epistemic imperialism for the scientific method, that people want empirical evidence for their beliefs. They are not going to accept this a priori argument. People want evidence. They want to be able to observe it, like with the perfect island example. If you can't then actually go and see that island for yourself with your own eyes, why are you going to believe it's there? Just because you've been able to conceive of it as the greatest possible island. So the fact this argument is not empirical means that it is not appealing. And we can then compare it with the teleological and cosmological arguments. And we can say that although they are flawed, at least they try and use empiricism. At least they do try and make inferences based on observations. Whereas with this argument, he's trying to define God into existence, which you could argue is unsatisfactory and ultimately unsuccessful. So the last thing for us to look at today then are the key questions that we started with. Do you think that existence can be treated as a predicate? Do you think there are logical fallacies in this argument that cannot be overcome? Does this argument justify belief? So does it even work for theists? Or as we've just seen, are most theists actually not convinced by it either? And do you think that a priori arguments such as this are successful? A couple of other questions to leave you with. Can God be defined into existence? Do you think that Anselm's definition of God is the correct definition? And how many religious people do share it? And of course, the most important question of all, does this argument prove God's existence? And that is the question that I will leave you with today. Thank you very much for joining me. I do hope that's been helpful. Have a brilliant day and good luck with all your studies.